Hello and welcome to our very first Facebook Live session. I'm Marguerite Picard, a Director of Melka. My co-director is Tricia Peters, Financial Planner, and tonight she's at home in her house. Our co-founder is Dr. Tina Sinclair, Psychologist, and tonight and always these days she's living and working in Canada where she's running her business Peacemakers for Families. Tonight we're going to be talking about parenting during the times of this COVID crisis and the restrictions that it's imposed on families and the problems that it's creating for parents. We know that there are lots of issues going on because we've had lots of phone calls, emails, and lots of questions have been submitted to us already tonight for this session. We want to reassure you from everybody here at Melka that we understand the dilemmas that people are facing, and our services are still running, although that's online and by Zoom, etc. We also really want to emphasise tonight that there is plenty of help for parents who are experiencing problems. Some of that help is not terribly well known. Parenting coordination is relatively new in this country, and I will speak a little bit more about that tonight. That's something to keep in mind, along with the thought that there are therapists, child psychologists, mediators, collaborative practice, and lots of other opportunities out there to help you, and we are just a phone call or an email away. I thought what we do tonight is just make a couple of general points about what it is to be a parent in these times. Then I'd like to review a statement or the essential points from a statement made by Chief Justice Alstergren, the Chief Justice of the Family Court. He made a statement last week about parenting during these times, and if anyone's interested in reading the full detail of that statement, it's on the Family Court website. I'll make some comments as well as observing the words that he has put in his statement about this, and then go to questions. A lot of the questions we've received and phone calls and inquiries we've had recently have been, what do we do about children's anxiety at this time? And having spoken to my colleagues, the psychologists and child psychologists, one of the things that's really clear is that if you are anxious as a parent, then your child is going to be more anxious. And one of the things that ramps up anxiety for children is seeing conflict between their parents. So even though this is more difficult than ever, so is the need greater than ever for parents to try to be on the same page with each other. Keeping yourself calm is going to have a positive effect on your children. And tomorrow night, our guest will be Margie Ulbrich, who is a relationship and trauma counsellor, and she's actually going to be giving some tips about how you can look after yourself, some of which is going to be calm-inducing. During this crisis, there's a lot of conflicting health information, and what we're starting to see is that parents have different levels of anxiety about the COVID pandemic. Personally, for some parents, this has actually triggered some kind of trauma. People have different understandings about the health and medical advice, and that's leading to conflict between them. That would probably be true for families who are living under the same roof, as well as families who are already living in two households. And I think the advice to everybody is the same. There needs to be some agreement about where it is that you're getting your health information. And what I would say, from my background as a legal practitioner, is that ought to be from an authoritative source. It ought to be from the federal and state government, and everybody ought to be reading that advice and deciding to rely on it. However, people are all different and have different concerns, different levels of understanding, and different interests in health. If you need help with it, there are mediators available, and you can do mediation really successfully online and via Zoom. But I think it's also an area where parenting coordination can be extremely helpful, and we can refer you to a parenting coordinator if you think that might be for you. Another thing that's coming up a lot all around the world is what happens when one parent works on the front line, or if both parents work on the front line and their risks are higher. What's the understanding between you about how you're going to recognise risk? What's going to be the points of conflict where you're trying to work out the reality of the risk that one or the other of you might be describing of your co-parent? And again, relying on reputable, government authorised information is the best that you can do. But if in the reality one of you is exposed, then you have to follow the government guidelines. And the harsh reality at this time is that probably what that means is there are many parents out there who are going to need to be physically isolated from their children for periods of time during this crisis. We're already hearing that a lot of health workers are voluntarily doing that to protect children and older family members. Again, all of the modern apps, Zoom, and the online possibilities for staying in communication with children is definitely something to think about. Also, a lot of parents are talking to us about the fact that grandparents have previously provided care for children, and now that's potentially unsafe. Grandparents are isolating themselves or withdrawing those offers of care to protect health. And what does that actually mean? And again, it is a question of relying on the authorities about what's wise there, but it raises a lot of dilemmas for parents about what to do when that kind of childcare is no longer available. And it's really going to take a lot of work, mediation help, facilitated conversations to work out what you can actually do, particularly with the pressures of working from home and the different schedules that people now have. So it's a tricky time. Help is there and you need to reach out for that. One of the other things I think is really important to think about here is there are going to be many occasions when either parent can be quite opportunistic about things that happen in the COVID times, about handover of children, interpretation of when school holidays start and finish, what to do on celebration days, Easter's coming up, and to think about your behaviour during this time is something that I can't emphasise enough. It's already being said in many places around the world, but I think it's really important to consider the fact that down the track, you're going to be judged on your behaviour during this time. You're going to be judged potentially by the legal system, by child psychologists who make reports to courts. You're going to be judged by yourself. You're going to be judged by your children, and you're going to be judged by your ex-partner or your partner. And these are the things that can feed into damaging relationships which are already fragile and not functioning well. And it's something for everybody to bear in mind at this time. So turning to the statement made by Chief Justice Alstergren, what he had said to families was, of course, we all agree with this, is to keep the best interests of your children at the forefront. And I guess what I know as a dispute resolution practitioner and what many others who work in this area would know is that what people think is in the best interest of their children is potentially quite different, and that's legitimately different perspectives. Sometimes there might just be a temptation to disagree for the sake of it, but quite often those perspectives are genuinely different, and working out what is best in terms of protecting your child's psychological health at this time, as well as their physical health, actually presents some challenges. So it's a simple statement to make. It's not necessarily a simple thing to live by. The Chief Justice has also said it's important to comply with court orders if that's possible. Again, that goes without saying. He's also made the comment that if you can't follow orders to the letter of the orders, then try to follow the spirit. Now, I think that's really problematic because the vast majority of Australian parents don't have court orders. They reach parenting plans or informal arrangements for their children. For those of you who have court orders, chances are that there's been a relatively high conflict relationship beforehand. And if those orders were made by a judge of the court rather than by you and your ex-partner or co-parent, I would really raise some doubts about the spirit in which they were entered into. So for people who've lived through that kind of conflict, whose parenting and relationships haven't healed as yet, then I think there's a real urgency to reach out for mediation, psychological and therapeutic support to make sure that you can make the best of this for your children. It's also really important to try to be reasonable, to try to have sensible conversations, to have conversations at all about these things. And they don't have to be face-to-face conversations. If your history is that they're not productive and they're not helpful for you, this is a time when they're going to be less so. So trying to have respectful and reasonable conversations, mapping out the time when you're going to have the conversations, the manner by which you're going to have them, if that's going to be text message or email, thinking about pausing, go away, do something else for a few minutes, reread what you've written, make sure to the best that you can that it's not capable of any misunderstanding. And if you're expressing things in it that are not going to be helpful, delete them. It's one of the advantages of actually doing something in writing rather than doing it on a phone. But if you are having phone conversations about these things and it's stopped being reasonable and sensible, it's a really smart idea to politely end the conversation. You should also know that the courts are still open. Mostly the work is being done virtually, but applications for changing orders, for new orders, for urgency, anything that's required to keep people and their children safe, the courts are still there. All lawyers are still going to be available, even if that's virtually. And the reality is that most of you are going to need lawyers to assist you to vary and change court orders by e-filing or however that's done. And also, of course, to help you in the negotiations leading up to it, there are going to be all of the services that you know about: parenting coordination, family dispute resolution, mediation, collaboration, child psychology. And the other thing, of course, is that if your children or you are in danger, you do need to call the police. Turning to some of the questions that have been sent in to us, I think in a sense some of them might already have been covered by some of the things that I've said. People have talked about emphasising how important it is to children to keep routine and to make time they spend with each parent safe and okay and as normal as possible. I guess that's a comment rather than a question, and of course I would agree with that. It is important to try to maintain children's routines. One of the other questions is about how much information do we give to children about COVID? And I think it's important, firstly, that it's the same information and not overloading children as much as you can, keeping them away from media. We know it's impossible for them not to understand that there's something afoot here because school holidays have been changed, life has changed, parents are working at home and life looks very different. But it's calming your children, reassuring them that you as parents can keep them safe, that's your job, that you will keep them safe, and that there are new rules that everybody has to follow, and the reason that we're following those rules is so that we are all safe. One of the other questions that we've received is, what if there is some kind of a barrier to time being spent because a parent is in isolation, either because of travel or work or some other occasion where one of the parents has come into contact with COVID? And I think obviously all that you can do is follow the government guidelines about that and be sensible and make sure that you as parents have a conversation about that. To have one parent not able to spend time physically with children can be replaced to a large extent by apps and Zoom and Skype and FaceTime. But also it has implications for the other parent who might now have the full-time care of children in a way that they hadn't done before. And so working out how you look after yourself during that period of time is also going to be something that comes up. People have asked about keeping orders in place, and I think I've covered that by looking at what the Chief Justice has said. Sometimes you can't keep the orders in place, sometimes you're going to be able to. There will be variations because sometimes children might have been dropped off or picked up at school or in public places like McDonald's that are no longer open and available to do that. And if that's the place, again, it comes back to being reasonable and sensible about making the changes. Very often parents who've made those plans in the first place have done it because of conflict, and they're trying to avoid each other at handover, and they're trying not to come into each other's houses or each other's territory because of risks of safety and a history of conflict. You can hand over at other public places that are still available, and if safety is a risk, then that's something to think really carefully about and make sure that conflict is not going to escalate at handover. And going back to the old parenting tips about don't have your conflict in front of the children, there was never a more important time for that than now. And one of those opportunities for conflict to crop up does tend to be around handover and pick up and drop off. So just being highly aware of that and having some kind of agreement, if at all possible, with your ex-partner is a good thing to do, whether you organise that on email, text or in writing somehow before you make those changes. And it's important that whatever changes you do make or you do have to make those changes in writing. Now, maybe there's a need to make those changes to court orders, but for most parents, just recording the changes in writing should be sufficient. And that's so there's clarity between you, there's no ambiguity. If one person is inclined to be forgetful or confused or to pretend that they or the other one are, it's a really good thing to have these things written down. There are some questions about grandparents and what to do about grandparents spending time with children. Well, we know that there have recently been some federal and Victorian state guidelines issued about that, and that may no longer be possible. One of the guidelines is for people over the age of 70 to isolate themselves, and for any grandparents over that age level, then I think the answer is obvious. Otherwise, again, trying to do some sort of Skype type conversation between grandparents and children is really helpful. There was actually some research that came out a couple of years ago about grandparents who'd never face-to-face met their children but had only spent time with them on Skype because they lived in different countries. And the research said that when the grandparents actually arrived in the countries where the children were, the children ran to them and hugged them as though they had known them all the time. So the visual stuff is really quite effective. You might be able to do something like visit between cars without people getting out of the cars and without there being any physical contact. Some people I know have had a picnic on the veranda outside the grandparents' house so that they could see each other through the window and chat on the phone. So some innovation and creativity is a great thing there, and it's going to provide variety in everybody's lives. So getting busy being creative on that one is a really good thing to think about. And if there are differences of opinion between the in-laws, the grandparents and the parents about what's the smart thing to do about self-isolation, again, this comes back to maybe there being an opportunity for everybody to get the kind of help that might be available from some of the therapeutic or dispute resolution support that's still available in most places. We had many questions about this, so many that we think maybe there should be another session actually answering queries from parents. Some of the questions overlapped between what happens about property and financial settlements, and we are having another session on that in 2 nights' time. But child support is one that did come up, and it's very relevant in parenting. For people who have child support agency assessments in place, but the reality of their income has now changed, that's really an issue that needs to be addressed with the child support agency. But of course, like all agencies, it's overwhelmed. Everyone there is run off their feet. So trying to be sensible about what expenses really need to be covered right now, what are the big expenses that can be deferred, but what are the daily expenses and how are they going to be covered? Maybe you need some mediation help with that, some financial planning advice, financial mediation. Again, reach out to us if that's the case, because it's real for many people. And when household incomes have diminished, financial pressures have been raised. A few questions have come to us about what's going to happen in terms of rental payments and mortgage payments where families are living in 2 households and struggling to meet those. And again, looking at what the government has to say about looking for rent rebates, moratoriums, deferral of rent and mortgage payments is something that we really urge people to do, because right now supporting yourselves and your children is going to be of the highest priority. Until our next session, everybody here at Melka wishes you well, stay healthy, stay safe, and we will see you again tomorrow night.